today. We're representing CLAREC, which are the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective. And we're here at the University of Cambridge. And one of the purposes of this collective is to counter the silences of Latin American research in the global debates around education. And so Javiera will be able to share with you a link to the website where you can see there are many researchers, Latin Americans and Latin American allies, who are sharing Latin American research in Cambridge. And today our session is going to focus on two presentations. So we begin with a presentation by three leading researchers in the fields of disability inclusive education in Latin America. So there are three speakers. The first is Professor Marisol Moreno Angarita, and she's from the National University of Colombia. And she has written extensively on policy using books and articles, and has been incredibly helpful to students who want to study Colombia, such as myself. And I know that she's been very helpful for others too, and we're delighted to have her here. There's also Associate Professor Leda Kamenopoulou, who comes from UCL in London. And she has written extensively on inclusive education, and what was particularly useful for me is that she's written extensively on Colombia as well. And I'll explain a little more about that later, and thank you. And also we have Associate Professor Shaun Grech, based at the University of Cape Town. He is an academic, a disability activist, and some of you may know him as well as being the Chief Editor of Disability in the Global South, and also Director of the Critical Institute, which he will tell you about more later. And like the dream team that they have collaborated on a recent chapter called Colombia and the Struggle for Social Justice. And we're extremely honoured to have a preview of that chapter, which will be featured in an upcoming book on key issues in special educational needs and disability, SEND, and inclusion. And so that will be published this year, I understand, but this is going to give us a bit of an opportunity to hear. Having had that, we'll have a question and answer session for 15 minutes there. And so for that, you will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A question and answer. That stands for question and answer. And we'd like any questions that you have to be placed in that rather than the chat. And so that Javiera is able to pull those questions together, and we'll have an opportunity to ask the three speakers questions at the end of their presentation. Once they have finished, then I will be presenting my PhD research, which looked at the inclusion of children with disabilities in Colombian Escuela Nueva schools. And after that time, we'll also be having some question and answers. So I want now to hand over to Marisol and Leda, who are going to be presenting, and Associate Professor Shaun Grech will be listening in the background, and he'll be there afterwards to answer more questions. So I'll hand over to you, Leda and Marisol.
Thank you very much, Julia. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Bring up the slides.
Yep, I can see them. I just need to make them full screen.
Yes, thanks for reminding me. Okay. Here we are.
Perfect.
So, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting us here today to this exciting event all about inclusive education in Colombia. It's a real pleasure to be here along with my good friends Marisol and Shaun and co-authors, it's just wonderful to have this opportunity to share our work with you. Today in this talk, like Julia said, we are going to present our most recent research on inclusive education in Colombia, focusing on this book chapter that we have just finished writing. Like Julia said, the chapter is for a book edited by Professor Alan Hodkinson and Dr. Zeta Brown. And the book focuses, it was a very ambitious project, and I think we've spent about 2 years, more or less, working on this chapter and the whole book as a project. The book covers, it's about international perspectives on inclusive education and SEND, and covers 6 continents and 12 countries. And Alan and Zeta wanted to have local experts on the countries selected. And this is why we, as a group, as a team, we were invited to write the chapter on Colombia, which we will be presenting today, and is entitled Colombia y la lucha por justicia social, Colombia and the struggle for social justice. The book is currently in press, so we just sent the final proofs last week. So very, very soon it should be published and made available. Okay, so just a bit about the rationale, why we think it's important to study inclusive education in Colombia. As we know, in mainstream global North literature, there is very little about inclusive education in context in the global South. And I will briefly explain to you why this is a problem, although I'm pretty sure most of you understand why this is a problem. We all know that inclusive education is a concept born in the North. It was a product of Anglo-American and Canadian collaborations to begin with. It's a Northern-born concept, and it does change its meaning and form, changes depending on local factors. So we have this paradox, although currently there's this discourse around inclusive education as a human rights issue across countries of the North and South. And although inclusive education is embraced, increasingly embraced internationally, there is still this issue of inclusive education changing form depending on the local context. Also, inclusive education and disability are concepts that are still quite vague and have been poorly defined. So currently we have this problem, although about 80% of people with disabilities live in context in the global South, we still know very little about the form of inclusion and exclusion that inclusion and exclusion take in global South contexts, and we know very little about the experiences and perspectives, the voices of the people who actually live in these contexts. So we need to, this is the reason why we need to explore, keep exploring inclusive education in Colombia, specifically as it relates to the experiences who live in this context. Now, why Colombia in particular? We think Colombia is a fascinating case study on inclusion in education in vulnerable groups, because although Colombia has adopted global goals, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, has aligned itself with international policies on inclusive education, in reality, Colombia remains an extremely challenging context. It's quite a unique context as well, because it's characterized by post-colonial hierarchies and structures, extreme economic inequality, corruption, poverty, and of course, the over 50 years long armed conflict, which has resulted, amongst other very many problems, has resulted in one of the highest number of internally displaced persons worldwide. So Colombia is an extremely interesting case study in relation to inclusion in and exclusion from education of various vulnerable groups, such as, for example, those with disabilities, those who live in the borders, remote areas, girls, migrants, and so on. So the aims, we had two aims when we put together, in putting together this chapter, we had two aims. First, we wanted to provide, we were asked by the editors to provide a historical overview and also of inclusive education in Colombia from the earliest days from when special education initially started through to today. And I believe we stopped with the current, post-pandemic era. This is where the chapter ends. We arrive to the current era, post-COVID. The other aim was to decolonize, to contribute to debates around the decolonization of inclusive education by making it relevant or exploring it in a way that is relevant to Colombia today, to the current opportunities and challenges that exist within this specific context. So these were our aims. Carrying on a little bit with the background. So I've already said that inclusive education is a northern concept, and it changes, it's mediated in different contexts depending on local factors. In terms of the local context of Colombia's particular local context, we have to, I don't know how to stress that. Perhaps people who do not come from Colombia, have never been in Colombia, might struggle to perceive that Colombia is synonymous with diversity. Extremely diverse country. According to the most recent census, 2018, it has about, let me see, I have my notes, 50 million, population of around 50 million people, and the 5th largest country in South America. I come from Greece, and I was amazed when I realized that my own country fits on the map of Colombia about 10 times. So it's also a huge, huge country. And the main characteristic, I would say, Colombia is synonymous with diversity. And in terms, there's a lot of diversity, biodiversity, rich in natural resources, etc. But what is most relevant here is Colombia's geographical diversity. So the geography of Colombia creates a lot of remote areas that may not, they're not always well connected with the rest of the country. They might have very poor, physical or virtual access with the rest of the country, which means that decentralization of services, resources, and the human population remains a key national challenge. So that's one point to bear in mind. And the second one is that Colombia is multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual. The most recent census, for example, 2018, identified 111 different indigenous groups. And their languages, customs, traditions survive to this day. So it's very important to bear this in mind, the human diversity of Colombia. And last point to add, in relation to the socio-political and economic situation, because of the recent economic crisis in Venezuela, Colombia has received about 1 million migrants from Venezuela, which include both people from Venezuela and Colombians coming back to Colombia who had emigrated before. So that's another, an additional challenge there. And just to conclude with my introduction, the World Bank keeps, they classify Colombia as a middle income country. So looking at this classification, one might think that is not that, it's not that poor, it's not a low income country, for example, but it's very important to bear in mind that it is the most unequal country in Latin America, which is also the most unequal continent in the world. So there's a lot of, there are many inequalities, social, economic, and access to services and education. So this is a very important characteristic of the Colombian context. I think I read in one of the books that I read about Colombia recently, preparing for a different talk. Why is it important to study Colombia? Because, why is it more important to study Colombia compared to a place like Norway, for example? Because in Norway, you do not see what you see in Colombia. You see the first, the second, and the third world living side by side. And this is why it's more important to explore and to learn about what happens in Colombia, perhaps more than in any other context. And last point to say here, just starting a bit the introduction about the education system, which Marisol will carry on in a minute. There is a formal framework in Colombia in relation to education, but also there is a lot of flexibility, so that the form that the system takes will depend on the locality and the local needs. But I'll leave that to Marisol to explain better, and I'll pass on the baton to her for the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Marisol. Gracias, Marisol.
Gracias, Leda. Y ahora
Thank you very much, Leda. Now we're going to change our language, honoring this inclusion, cultural inclusion. Now, I would like to tell you all, probably some of you already know, Colombia is one of the few countries which doesn't have a national curriculum. In the whole country, there is no equality in the contents, but since '94, with a general law of education, each institution must create an institutional educational project based in the needs, in the characteristics. This sounds on paper very interesting. In theory, is good, and it's a reason to be proud for the national system, but in reality it's very complex. In the end, many schools basically assimilate or follow, harmonize with the national exams. They are aligned with some hierarchies and strategies. At the beginning, this was better because the institutional educational project at the beginning was following the PILAS tests, the standardized tests, but it's not happening now. The other important key issue in educational inclusion in education is that the concept of ability and disability has been understood differently in different contexts. There is still an approach which is like understanding that people with disabilities shouldn't be included, that they should be isolated in separated contexts. We come from a special education that finished in '94. There is no special education. And now we are in an integrated education. We are living in the frame of the disability frame, which is a better approach, but this notion of disability has changed throughout history. The transformation of the concept of disability is apparent. We stopped thinking about limitation, deficiency, lackness, to now be aligned with an understanding. However, still nowadays, the approach has been very paternalist. This minority group of disabled people are not capable, they cannot participate, they require some support, kind of like some charity. And this is challenging, and it's very difficult for the context to understand disabled people to be acknowledged as independent people who can participate fully in society. So in reality, currently, there is an effort in the last decade to adopt a model of human rights. The laws that have been enforced in the last decade are talking about capacities, about the rights. They talk about the possibility to leave behind the medical approach to disability. However, in practice, in the imaginary of people, professionals involved in education or in medicine, or in general in the state, there is this ableism, this wish to ask people to be like normal, to be part of the standards of normality, in which everybody needs to walk in the same way, move in the same way, process information in the same way. So let's say that this concern about like rehabilitating has been always present in the imaginary of the families and the people working in education. And of course, also in many people with disability who understand their disability in that way. In the last decade, in the frame of this master's on disability, we managed to create a Colombian model of disability that acknowledges these theories drawn from the social model that kind of like brought to the fore the idea that disability is produced by society. Disability is more something that is part of the mind of people and in the interaction of people, not in the people themselves. Studies have shown that people with disabilities can only realize of this situation when they go to school and they experience stigma and rejection. When they are very young, they participate normally in their communities and in their families. But this idea of exclusion is not as strong. In the Colombian model, we try to bring more elements related to ability from the perspective of Martin Nussbaum, the necessity to change and transform the context and recognize that disability is a social construct, dynamic, changing, and installed in historical context, as Leda has shown before. So the path towards inclusion, which I think it's important to acknowledge that we're on that way, started from the 60s with the schools for deaf and blind people. This is something that happened in many different places in the world. The movement of people with visual impairment and people deaf have made a huge contribution to the fight for inclusion, something that we're experiencing nowadays. So this was created through the state, the National Institution for Deaf People and the National Institution for Blind People. But in '94, something very interesting happened. So at the same time that the Salamanca is happening in the Salamanca Declaration is happening, the Colombian Ministry of Education adopts this frame in the General Law of Education. But there is no a transition process. There is no negotiation, but it's an imposition. It's imposed the elimination of the special education all of a sudden. And also that everybody needs to go to the classroom. So there is a promise of education for everyone, and we want to see it, but when there is no conversation with the teachers or with everyone involved, you can see the results that we've seen in Colombia. So we've had this policy since '94, But after almost 20 years, in 2017, there was the need to create a new norm because there wasn't this acknowledgement of the necessity of the right to education via the inclusive education. So even though in 94, the education was for everyone, was for all, it was still moving in the frame of integration. The emphasis was that students with special needs were those who needed to develop skills to integrate themselves and to take part of the educational system. It's a very rehabilitation frame. Only later, the inclusion with the approval of the 2000, only until 2009, it's more evident, this process, this change. So from 94, politically, there was this idea of education for everyone, but only 10 years later, it started like 10 years later, this policy was confirmed. As a result of this convention for this policy, so it started this emphasis to pay attention to diversity, which is the other aspect, as Leda said, that Colombian context has forced the acknowledgement that there is the need of intersectionality to acknowledge diversity. This is something specific to Colombia. Diversity is diverse. It's not only being disabled or being differently ethnically or sexually or being a victim of displacement, but also it was important and necessary to go quickly from an understanding of inclusive education focused on people with disability to understand that that minority, the disability group, was just one group of all other groups that also had needs and particularities to be involved in the education system. So third, I would like to highlight that Colombia has adopted international models. That's another strong characteristic in Colombia. So how the conventions, the agreements, the international treaties have been more important than the local policies. As I said, like the policy from 94 was never implemented. When the convention came, there was an effort, like there was a bigger desire to implement the inclusive education and education for all. Some practical factors are like there are some barriers that come from inequality, inequity, and different aspects from diverse populations. For example, the students who are victims of the displacement, of the armed conflict, they are included under the frame, the umbrella of inclusive education, and they are recognized as students under the umbrella of inclusion. This is something that has been very confusing in Colombia. They call inclusive children those who have disability, but also those who are victims or who have been displaced. So in the schools, you have like general institutions, and then you have like the students of inclusion. And that has been a barrier very important in terms of imaginaries to make the educational system understand that sometimes you could be left behind. So there were two groups created, the bigger group and then this smaller group of inclusive students. In practice, there hasn't been an acknowledgement of the difference in the learning process. Colombia hasn't understood that every single student is diverse, not only those under the rights are like inclusive students. So the populations in the inclusive education includes groups that have been historically excluded because poverty, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or social class. So inclusive education is not only limited to education for people with disabilities. This is something very interesting. So please do not attribute this confusion to Colombia. Colombia has received this confusion from the UNESCO guidelines, the international organizations. So we have taken this tension between different groups that search to be included and participate. And of course, the inclusive education is connected to the Goal 4 of Sustainable Development, which proposes and this is like the last approach to inclusive education in Colombia, is trying to create an inclusive and equitable quality of education to promote a lifelong learning opportunities for everyone. Within 2 weeks, the new policy of inclusive education will be promoted in Colombia, which is harmonized with the Sustainable Development Goal 4. But we still have too many challenges. These challenges are associated to the implementation. I would like to highlight that the system understands the challenges of acknowledging the particularities of everyone, but especially in inequalities between social classes, in everything that has to be with the social factors that creates to equiparate and equalize opportunities in terms of the access. There have been like several initiatives, free matriculation, trying to create incentives for teachers who want to work in inclusive education. There's also a big effort on teacher training, which is something that hasn't been solved. There have been several ways to try to train teachers, trying to train and co-teaching, accompaniment. However, there is still nowadays, even from the group of teachers, the color, they have raised their voices, being against or opposing the inclusive education. So it's incredible that after 20 years of having a policy for inclusive education, some teachers are still questioning that students with disabilities have the right to go to learn to school with everyone. Fortunately, 2 years ago, during the social awakening, the teachers had a very important role, and the teachers had a negotiation. They reached 36 agreements with the Ministry of Education, and we managed to get, for the first time in the last 30 years, that the teachers accepted that we need to move towards the inclusive education, and that they needed to check, to see carefully how this inclusive education was going to be implemented in Colombia. What is like behind all this conversation is the necessity to reduce all the gaps in education. And this is something that was also important with the peace agreement, the gap, the gender gap and the technological gap that were like exacerbated by the pandemic. So the conversation between FECODE and the ministry, there was like this conversation, which have been slow, about this inclusive education. So the peace agreement has also made visible and have given resources, has shown the importance of rural education. This will be explained later by Julia. So I would like to finish saying that there are many interesting things about Colombia, but a very important lesson is that regardless, the policy of education for all has been, was created like 30 years ago. This is not a reality in Colombia. How can you explain that? There are many theories, sociocultural theories about it. Shaun might probably explain something else about this during the Q&A, but a very huge hypothesis is that there is no policy that guarantee what society and a collective is willing to grant people. The policies are what the societies decide to give. So as a summary, we need to be honest and say that it's been very positive. The intervention of the international conventions, I honestly say that without the convention in 2006 that Colombia ratified in 2009, we couldn't have advanced in the latest advancement. So we did a decree based in people with disability in 2017, when Colombia as an educational system was already in the umbrella of attending disability. So the ministry had to create this decree specifically based in disability to convey the message that the promises of quality education and inclusive education hasn't been made. And now Leda continues.
Gracias, Marisol. Thank you very much for this. Very interesting. Although I could hear, I chose the English language and I could hear you in the background. This is why I couldn't change the slides always. But anyway, I'm just going to bring this to a close after you know, the great overview of the biggest part of the chapter that Marisol just delivered. Our argument, the way we conclude the chapter is obviously that we need to continue thinking about inclusive education in Colombia as a broader concept, which is in line with, you know, all the recent policies and this effort to align Colombia with more recent current understandings of inclusive education as a response to diversity and not a response to disability. So the need to broaden the understanding of inclusive education to make it relevant to Colombia and all the challenges and the vulnerable groups that exist in this country. And on our part, as researchers, as, you know, theorists of inclusive education, we need to keep adopting culturally sensitive approaches, approaches that focus on the voices and experiences of the people who have, you know, first-hand experiences of this context and its challenges. And the last conclusion, which is how more or less we close the chapter, it's very important to bring in the voices of children. We realized when writing the chapter, we found almost nothing on inclusive education in Colombia, focusing on, you know, the perspectives of the children themselves. So it's a big gap in our current knowledge. We really need to make sure, I mean, this is a requirement more and more nowadays, to include the children's voices in all those debates about quality, inclusive and equitable quality education, which is their right. And this is, I think, exactly how we finished the chapter, that currently, despite all those policies, all this legislation, inequality and exclusion still persist in Colombia because of it's a very challenging context. And we said that all does not mean all currently in Colombia. It means just some. So we need to keep working, thinking, and working on inclusive education in Colombia in a way that responds to the needs and realities of this very particular, very unique context. And that is our presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and we're ready for your questions. We look forward to your questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. What a fascinating presentation with so much richness to it. And we do appreciate your efforts so very much. It was fantastic. Javiera, I know that we're looking at the question and answers there. We've not seen any so far. And I think, so just to be clear, people, you won't be able to speak like you would normally in a Zoom session. And that's because we are using translation, which means it's a slightly different format. So if you would like to add in questions, please feel free to add them there in the question and answer, although we have one there. Just before we do that, Shaun, I didn't know, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that presentation, or anything else you wanted to say, or should we wait for the questions?
No, just a couple of things to, in support of what Leda and Marisol have very adequately discussed. And the point perhaps I would like to push forward and to emphasize is that inclusive education has over the past years become a meta-narrative in itself. We need to question and contest, especially to see how this as a discourse and practice pans out in practice without fear of questioning, without fear of seeing how inclusive education even transforms or is even resisted within different spaces of poverty, for example, and to actually see and emphasize and stress the alternatives proposed by people and families on the ground themselves, and to perhaps move the whole discourse away from a discourse of policies and professionals. That's it for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shaun. Javiera, did you want to share the question there?
There is a question in the Q&A box that I'm going to read. I'm also going to remind in Spanish, las preguntas que ustedes tengan, por favor, pueden hacerlas en la cajita de Q&A que está abajo. I'm going to read a question that Carolina made. She's from Argentina, and she says that even though Colombia has its own particularities, she as an Argentinian also feels that there are a lot of similarities in this clash between what international agreements or treaties said and what is feeling and experience collectively as a culture and as a country. And her question is if you identify any process, any key process that would make this be different or make this work in another way, so that people can perceive inclusion differently.
Would you like me to answer? I don't mind starting to answer. First of all, as Julia has a very brilliant, I know I've read all of Julia's thesis, I was lucky enough. She has a very brilliant chapter about drawing together research on Latin America in general, and there are many commonalities in this context. I think it's two things in my experience, but others may disagree. So it's two things. One is what Marisol said, imported discourses, uncritically imported discourses from the North. Which may have been imposed. We spoke about UNESCO and this confusion Marisol mentioned, confusion about the meaning of inclusive education that started from UNESCO, and we all know and use the index. And when I did my research in Colombia, teachers were talking to me about the index, which has been translated, and so it's amazing we can use it, but do we really? Can we really? I think the other problem I've seen, and I think that people who come from Latin America who are here today might have different views, but every time I present my work in international audiences, I notice that there's resistance from both the North and the South to engage with these debates. So Northern people normally, think about the South in terms of, underdeveloped, barbaric ideas that are not in line with human rights, blah, blah. So they have this view of the South and that it should be brought up to the civilized standards of the North. On the other hand, I think this is a bigger issue. I see that the South looks up to the North, and I really don't know how this can change. It's this tendency of whatever comes from the North, it's amazing, and we should do it straight away. Like Marisol said, the same year as Salamanca changed the law in Colombia without having any discussion with people on the ground. So I think I don't have answers to these issues, but this is my experience and the way I've been thinking about these issues.
Did anyone else want to come in on that? Marisol?
Yes, I would like to, me gustaría,
I would like to comment that when I see the commonalities in Latin America, and specifically in Colombia, I can see that there is something related with the incapacity of our societies and governments understand human rights. I think that's the main barrier, that is the problem for inclusive education. When I see, for example, in Scandinavia, that inclusive education is not something particular for some people, but it's like an embedded discourse that is part of society, in health, in culture, in where like human beings are valued regardless the adjectives that are put next to them. That's the main thing for me. In Latin America, maybe for our histories, for colonialism, for the way in which we've felt maybe like less that there is someone over us. So we've regarded people according to the adjectives or the attributes. So that's why we have these discourses on social class that are very strong, same with gender, because the essence and the concept of being human is something that is very fragile. It has been weakened. It's a concept that has been replaced by the adjective of social class, gender, and so on. An example of this is that in Colombia, and I say this feeling very sad and ashamed, there is a term in Colombia, desechable, disposable. This term in the 80s and the 90s, desechable, disposable, were like homeless people, and people would normally talk about this. This morning, I saw a disposable person when I was walking. So societies that assume that people and human beings are not worthwhile just for being humans produces these types of results, a context in which it's very difficult to acknowledge the difference. And I would like to finish this comment with an idea with why is it that society look at bodies and those bodies, only looking at them, attribute some kind of functions, and those functions a priori so like attributing some capacities just by looking at the bodies, and those abilities are assigned a specific role in society. So this reality is completely opposed to what is suggested as the doings, the beings. Human freedom would be that one in which one can choose the life project that one considers valuable. This is something that doesn't happen in our countries for people with any kind of diversity or difference. Society decides for them, and for people with disabilities, beforehand are like regarded as something less. And the only door that is opened is the charity and the successful experiences that we have, and we have quite a few good experiences in inclusive educations, thanks to the policies. Some of them, most of them, are like accompanied by female teachers because they want to be loving, like philanthropic, and they have managed to help these students to thrive. There is just a few teachers. This is something that I have learned throughout my life. There is a myth that has affected this trajectory, and it's believing that the teachers need to be trained in something specific, extraordinary, exotic to be part of inclusive education. And this is not true. I am convinced that the type of teacher that we need for inclusive teacher is simply a good teacher, a teacher that has been trained in that subject that they want, with some human values, some ethics, because those values are part of education. Principles, solidarity, and a teacher that is aware that needs to guarantee human rights for people and for students, specifically the right to education. These are some aspects that have affected Latin American context. So people prefer to think that inclusive education is something that is for other teachers, for other people, and not for them. Yeah. Would you like to say something, Shaun?
Not much in truth. I think just perhaps to round off that, the importation of discourses and hegemonic discourses is often taken up by powerful stakeholders within local contexts too. So imported discourses from the global north very often are also co-opted by privileged urban disabled people's organizations, for example, in countries such as Colombia or Guatemala, who are very happy to sing along to the tune of dominant discourse produced somewhere else, in a space that is perceived as more knowledgeable and where this discourse is also perceived as even more legitimate. So one thing perhaps to add is the need to actually question power dynamics, including within or the assumed unity of the disability movement, for example, within one particular context or one particular continent itself. I think very often we tend to assume that if some or other urban DPO is around a decision table, around the policy decision table in some place in a capital city somewhere, we tend to assume that that representative from the DPO actually knows anything about their own country, in particular rural areas, or how life in poverty is actually lived. I have to stop here and I actually have to leave. I'm very sorry about this, but I have to jump into another space.
No, Shaun, thank you so much for your participation. And that leads you very nicely into my presentation. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to all three presenters for your contribution on that.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Shaun.
Thank you. Bye.
And so I'm going to carry on with the presentation, kind of putting that into context and to share with you my PhD research. Just see if I can share this here. You know, there's always that tense moment where you're never quite sure if it will share. So Javier, I can see your face. Is that sharing okay? Brilliant. Okay. So yes, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, which just chimes with so much of what I'm going to be presenting to you today. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about my research, which looked at including children with disabilities in Colombian Escuela Nueva schools. And so Colombian Escuela Nueva schools are specifically, and in my particular case, in rural areas in this particular case. And so to tell you a bit more about me and what brought me to my research. So you will notice that as a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, I'm somewhat older than many of my compatriots. And the reason for that is that I've already had a career in disability. And I began as a teacher, which enabled me to become an educational psychologist in the UK. And in the UK, to be an educational psychologist focuses less on diagnosis and more about helping teachers manage and educate children with diverse needs. So disability will be a key aspect of that, but also it could be to do with poverty, to do with any number of different things that impact upon a child's ability to learn, socio-emotional well-being, that kind of thing. And so having worked in a very inclusive municipality in the UK, in an area called Nottingham, which is famous for Robin Hood, I then went independent and have increasingly worked around the world as an international disability consultant. And so I've worked in lots of different countries. I've worked, as you can see from the pictures here, in Bangladesh. I've worked a lot in Moldova. I'm also currently working on Mongolia at the moment. And to the top right there, you can see that I was in Afghanistan. And working in Afghanistan was a particular moment for me that led me to my career at the University of Cambridge as well. But mostly I've worked in Latin America, as you can see there in the bottom left. And I've worked in different countries in Latin America, but I've worked 8 times in Colombia. So I was already quite aware of the Colombian context. Another thing that I do is that I illustrate conferences live. So as people present, I draw pictures for big global events and also consultations with small community groups, all sorts of things. And it's because of these experiences that I put my career on hold to come back to looking at research. And it's specifically when I was in Afghanistan. So I was brought into Afghanistan to evaluate a project in the north in 2012. So at that time it was more peaceful than it is now, even in the last 2 years, and then of course recently. And I was there meant to be the expert on inclusive education, thinking about what would Afghans need to help set up inclusive education at a practical level in their area. And there's this wonderful project, really, really good project. But while I was there, I was thinking, what on earth am I doing here? Why am I being treated as the expert when clearly the experts are the people who know the local culture, they know the local constraints, everything, they are local experts. And so that was a question that made me think, you know what, I do think I should go back and think some more about what it means to deliver inclusive education in different contexts, and then using visual participatory methods. And so, as I've told you, I illustrate conferences. And so part of what I did is illustrated my thesis. We'll give you a link later for my thesis, but I'm going to talk you through this top half of my PhD poster and where I'm coming from. So my main question was looking at how children with disabilities understood and addressed in Colombian Escuela Nueva schools. And my thinking around this was this. So first off, as Marisol has talked about, Colombia has committed to quality inclusive education, but there's a gap between policy and practice. And my research focused on disability because of the many ways in which children are diverse. I was aware that children with disabilities are the most marginalised, and I wanted to look at the intersections too, but that was my focus. And one of my concerns is that people say, well, there's a gap between policy and practice because teachers aren't doing this enough, or we are not doing this enough. And it holds back to that standard of what inclusive education is. And my concern was that one of the reasons, if not only reason, but one reason, is that the models of inclusive education that are promoted and held to a standard don't fit the local contexts. And so, for example, in rural contexts, this is a global issue. How do people deliver inclusive education in rural contexts? And in Colombia, we know that the outcomes of children are strongly, strongly affected by intersections of wealth, gender, and location. And so children in rural areas are least likely to achieve in schools. And it's a highly, highly unequal society, such that children who are rich are going to do much better than children who are poor. In addition to that, around the context is that Leda's research was extensive, found that teachers haven't received practical training. So these are Colombian issues as well as global issues. So rather than thinking, well, the answers are out there, as in terms of international ideas, really interesting what Marisol was saying, that actually that's pushed practice forward. But being concerned about local and national level rural achievement was a thing that has actually already been addressed by Colombians. And so I wanted to challenge the deficit accounts of teacher practice and this idea about, well, people in the global south need just to then reach international standards, to think about what's already working well in context. And that led me to a model, a successful model of education called Escuela Nueva. So to introduce you to this model of Escuela Nueva, you see a photo here, and this is Vicky Colbert. In 1978, she was the Vice Minister of Education. And she knew about this model that already existed in Colombia that was all over Latin America. It's called a unitary school model. And it's basically like a single school, multi-grade classroom in which you have a single teacher, and the children will be all the local children, likely probably in one class of all ages. And so there was interest in, well, how can we make this unitary model? How can we make it more sustainable in the Colombian context? Because equally in rural areas in Colombia, children were underachieving, the textbooks weren't interesting, they weren't relevant, and Vicky Colbert thought, how can we make this a Colombian success? So she worked from the ground up with teachers, she brought in educators into the ministry groups, and she evolved this idea of Escuela Nueva, the model of Escuela Nueva. So to explain that a little more to you, because it's now evolved such that she now has a foundation and it exists alongside the state rather than part of the state. But many children are being educated in this model. And so what it does, it educates children using a number of techniques that I think chime with the inclusive education research. So for example, children learn using learner guides, which have child-centered creative activities. And they purposely learn in groups. So they're learning with their peers and support each other with groups. So it's a lot about dialogue, discussion, active things. They go outside to look at things, come back, report. The focus on reading and writing is less because it's more about active learning, although reading and writing is a part. It's also multi-grade by choice. So teachers who teach in Escuela Nueva classrooms are used to diversity by design. That's part of the deal. And so that's kind of my thinking, well, that equally could potentially be inclusive in its practice for children with disabilities whose level of learning might be different to that of their age equivalent peers. Another key factor is children learn at their own pace. So by design, it was aimed at children living in rural areas who may have to leave their school to go and help with the harvest. And so it accepts that children will learn at different paces and that they go at their own pace. And it has great links with the school and community. It focuses on building social relationships. And finally, the thing that really makes a difference, I think, is that the teacher training then, teachers aren't there to didactically teach everything strictly. It's more about they facilitate the learning of the children, and they are taught multi-grade strategies as part of the teacher training. And the form of the teacher training is they are taught in the same way that they will then teach children. And Javi is translating now, that must be a nightmare to translate. But the idea being that in the same way that children learn by learner guides, then teachers learn by learner guides, and they learn the practical techniques working in groups. And that means they're fully versed in that form of teaching by the time they teach children. So the research for this is extremely positive. It positively affects children's learning, so that children learning in these schools in rural areas compared with their urban counterparts have sometimes surpassed their learning achievement levels. Over decades, it's been found to be very successful to children's learning. Also, self-esteem and social skills are seen to be higher for those children in Escuela Nueva schools compared with other rural schools. And there's research that's ongoing that has shown that over time. But if you look then at the research, there's certainly a gap in the research around rural schooling and disability. Very little on Escuela Nueva and nothing on disability, or really intersections other than kind of a location. And there's nothing on children's views. And so my research drew on critical disability theory and ideas of decoloniality as Latin American to challenge this deficit discourse around teachers in the South. I wanted to look at, we know this is working well, how might this be applied? And Escuela Nueva has been used now, applied in 16 different countries. I wanted an emphasis on intersectional understanding of disability. So not just it's a child's condition, but more about what's happening in the context around them, individually, how does that impact? And also to privilege the voice of participants. And so I conducted a multi-site case study. As you can see here, there's very rural area. It was 2 hours from a large city and about an hour away from a semi-urban hub. Each school, there were 5 schools, and each school was in a very rural area. Most were single schools, but 2 had 2 or 3 classes in that school. So the ones basically that were further down the hill and closer to the town had more children. So they had like an infant and a junior class, and one had a nursery. And as you can see, the schools are well equipped. They each have a kitchen, they have a security guard, they have specific furniture which moves around so that you can move and have children working in groups or individually. That's quite a feature of Escuela Nueva. And I wanted to show you this picture of the children with iPads. So also there was resources that came from the municipality, but children will work through the guides, but also there were various other resources. The children themselves lived in very rural houses, as you might imagine, up to sometimes 2 hours away from their school. Most of their parents worked as agricultural workers, so potatoes was the main crop that was grown there. And also there was milking and animals, so looking after livestock as well. And there were kind of farms that had these, some of them were leased and some of them were owned, working within the fields. And so my research conducted, it was working with 101 children, 26 of whom identified as having a risk of disability using something called the Washington Group questions, which I can tell you about later if we have time, or you can Google them. And that's like an internationally comparable way of thinking, what functional difficulties do children have? What I did is I did activities with 43 children. So they were all the children in the school that were over 7, between 7 and 11. I did 21 interviews with 10 teachers. Then I did 9 interviews with Escuela Nueva leaders and staff. I observed 15 lessons, 15 separate classes within these schools, the 5 schools. And I did interviews with 14 parents. And so bringing that together, to tell you a bit more, so children's views, I did 3 things. I care very much about children's voice, and I used an emancipatory technique called photo voice. They did drawings, and also I added in an individual interview that I'll explain to you in a second. So photo voice is an emancipatory technique that has been used with lots of different groups, including children. And what it involves is teaching children how to use cameras, because of course they know how to selfie, but not, it's like all cameras. So you train them in how to use cameras, help them get over the excitement of just taking lots and lots of photos. And then they go around with a guided question about what helps and does not help me learn. And so children went around, they took those photos, I printed them off, we talked about them individually for me to help understand where the children were coming from. And then in groups, they worked as a school or as a group to put together what were the themes that were relevant to them, what did they all say. And so here you can see an example of School B that I pulled together the things that they said help them learn. Above it says working in projects, so there's kind of working in themes and doing trips. To the left, they're saying friendships. Below, they're saying teachers. And to the right, they're saying materials such as posters and things that help us learn to read and to write. Also, key to all schools came up was nature. They love the natural environment. And below the bottom, you can see they said that food and a clean school also helped them to learn. So they had lunches and snacks at the school as well. And in this school, they said what didn't help them to learn was fighting. But when I examined that some more, it wasn't the saying there was fighting. They were just kind of saying squabbling or fighting wouldn't help. And the bottom right, you might just be able to see two little bugs. There were some biting bugs there that would something that definitely did not help them learn. And so the other thing I noticed when I looked at the evidence was I didn't really have much on, but what is it like if you're stuck? And so I created a visual interview called When I'm Stuck, or in Spanish, Cuando me dificulta algo, when something I find is difficult. And I asked the children to identify what was the topic where they're most likely to feel stuck. So for this little girl, it was sociales, which is a bit like social studies. And then I had some faces, and I wanted them to point or circle the faces that best describe their emotions. And then I asked them, if you're stuck, tell me about who helps you. And I asked them about their friends, their teachers, and their family. And this little girl, she's saying, oh, I'm worried that when I'm stuck, I worry that my mum or my dad will be cross with me. Whereas when we talked about her parents, how would they react if she was stuck, they said she'd be very helpful. And you can see here, the child had the opportunity to draw if they wanted. In this particular one, this was drawn by the translator. And so my findings are, I'm going to put into 3 different categories. So you can see here, the first one is understanding of disability. The second is the Escuela Nueva model and disability. And the third one is about teachers and supporting teachers and what are the implications of that. So first off, I'll tell you about understanding of disability. With all my participants, I found that everybody, similar to what Marisol said earlier, had an understanding of disability that was focused on the medical model. So they saw disability as a permanent, usually condition, which they named labels, and they see that as something that won't change, located within the body. And within Colombia, we have Decree 1421 of 2017 that Marisol mentioned. And that created some individual education planning systems with support teachers. And I found that those plans were in place in my schools, but that they were framed within a medical model. So there was a whole focus on, within this group planning, where we had parents and other people from outside, they were saying we need a diagnosis. There was a focus on getting a diagnosis or worrying about a lack of support from home. And all of this led me to question what the benefits of diagnosis were at the end, and to explain that a little more. When I compared the things that the teachers had said about what was going on with families and what was going on around disability with what the parents had said, I found a bit of a disconnect. So I would say broadly, the teachers got on very well with the parents, and they were valued by the parents. But when I compared what they'd said, they'd missed the intersections. So for example, the idea of poverty, teachers were saying, well, they're not poor, that phrase, pobre, pobre, was used quite a lot. Whereas when I talked to parents, they did have money worries, and also that there's a thing called the canasta familiar, which is like the family basket. And people are given by the state food to contribute to their family. And some of the parents did have this canasta familiar, but the teachers weren't all sure who they were. And then also this phrase came up about a lack of support, so falta de acompañamiento, which is very difficult to say. And this idea about lack of support, when I explored or listened to parents more, they were talking about the sheer just quantity of rural demands. So having to get up so early get up at 4 in order to milk the cows, in order to be able to get the children up, to then be able to get those children to school. There was a family who weren't attending, and that was seen as a lack of support. But when I examined why they weren't attending, it was to do with the rains, because we're in such a rural area, that the horse couldn't cross the river. And so then when it came to disability, this was even more the case. So if a person wants a diagnosis on which there was great pressure, the parents have to do it and the pressure for them to do so. When they did that, they would have to take 2 days off work. And these are agricultural workers whose cows need milking. They're not going to wait. And so the system would be that it would take at least 2 hours then to get down to the area where you could get the diagnosis. In Colombia, you have 2 days. The first day you need to pay in order to know that you're coming. The second day is when you attend. So that's 2 days off work. And then also found in this area of Colombia, there weren't appointment times, there are only appointment windows. So if you attend, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get seen. And so you have to get there very early, and people who are agricultural workers are going to find that harder because they're so far away and they have tasks to do before they come. So this really made me question why we got such a focus on diagnosis if ultimately it's not going to make a difference and it adds so much pressure to parents. The second area is about escuela nueva and disability. And so broadly, I found in my observations that there were high quality inclusive lessons, and that was almost all teachers. That was very engaging lessons, children very well included. And interestingly, compared with what Marisol was saying, their attitudes towards inclusion was broadly very positive, and I could see that as much as hear it. But where they were super positive about it for social reasons, but felt much more ambivalent around academic reasons, and that was where it came. Then for the children themselves, they also were very happy with the Escuela Nueva model. They liked the guides broadly. They felt they had friends. They thought people helped them learn. But there were some dilemmas that really made me think about, yes, this model is in so many ways it's inclusive, but there are still some issues. So one of the things is that the learner guides, they are very inclusive and they help children work in groups, but they don't necessarily work for non-readers. And that was particularly a concern for teachers, where they didn't want to put the children in groups where they couldn't access the literature, as in the guides. So for the schools that had infant classes, they wouldn't let children start the guides until they could read. And so that's a bit of an issue. And some children with disabilities did say they found the text a bit tiring sometimes. The other thing was, I had thought that, well, that wouldn't matter because you've got the groups, you've got the peer support that can help overcome the reading issues. And what I found is that broadly, peer support is very positive for children and they felt supported. But when I compared the responses of the children with disabilities with the non-disabled children around their experiences of getting help when they're stuck, it was the children with disabilities that had many more mixed experiences. So not all negative, but just mixed. So some said, children can't always help me. 2 children in particular were very ashamed of asking for help. They wouldn't ask for help because they'd be too embarrassed. Whereas others said that sometimes they help, sometimes they tease. So it helps, but it's not a panacea. And then the other thing that really fascinated me was going at your own pace. I just thought, well, this is amazing. You've got this system where children go at their own pace. Perfect. But for teachers and children, that caused a dilemma. So for teachers, they want children to be ready, but at the same time, they don't want them to get over age, so that you don't want a child who is too old for the grade in which they're in. And in Colombia, if you don't pass the year, you have to repeat the grade. And so there's this idea about the repeating the grade is one of children's terrors. When they talked about things they worried about, this was very much, I can't lose the year. And this was something that really, really worried them. So it's not just what teachers use, but how they do that. And so then I looked at, well, what are some of the factors that are impacting on teachers? And what I found is, yes, while individual factors did have an impact, so some teachers preferred to do interactive lessons, whereas others didn't. Actually, what made an impact is the school context. So everybody found multi-grade schools challenging, but those who were in school with more class were more able to share ideas. Whereas if you're in a single multi-grade class, you were the only teacher, you had lots of demands, which included signing for food that arrives, lots of different extra demands, and it's very challenging, and you've got no one to share with. Also, in the teacher training and support, nobody had training on disability and how to manage it in a practical way, and that where they had learned, it was all theory, but not practice. And they loved the Escuela Nueva training, but they hadn't sustained the systems within the school around meeting each month to do problem solving. And so what the implications of my research? I mean, there are many, but to summarize, I would say that teachers need training, but they need training that's practical, situated, and ongoing. So we know the practical, but the situated is, if you're in a small multigrade school, nobody had training on multigrade when they're in their initial teacher training. And what about if you're in rural compared with urban? Because urban also has its different problems with giant class sizes. And then it should be ongoing. It can't just be a drop and then run, or even cascade. It's about helping people have support as they go along. Also made me think we need clarity on the purpose of a diagnosis. If it doesn't benefit anyone, then why put all the effort into it? Because I think we'd be better putting effort into networks of support for teachers and support teachers. So networks of support for teachers and support teachers to work together. And then I would kind of add to that finally that within this, I was saying to you, it's a rural context. And I think that often rural is presented as a problem to be solved. But I would argue it's not a problem, it's just a different context. And if you think about what rural does have, it has a community, it has strengths that can be drawn upon. And especially where the presence of the state is likely to be less because it is further away, then my thought is that it's about building on the strengths of the community. And I wanted to illustrate this in one conversation that I had with one of the many gorgeous children that I spoke with. But there was one girl. So do you remember I told you about the girl who had not been able to attend because the horse couldn't get across the river that was too high? So I was talking to her about that and the difficulty she felt about coming back to school, having missed school for a long time. And we're talking about things she liked. And she went, so this, I'll say it in English, obviously. She said, "Julia, do you know the thing I like? You know the thing I like best?" And I was like, "Yes, no, you tell me." And she said, "I wake up in the morning and I open the door and I look out and I go," and this is where she did this action that I'll never forget. She went, "Ay, mi tierra." And it was just this moment where I just got, and to explain what that means. So, "Ay, mi tierra" in English would mean like, "Oh, my beautiful country, my land." It means my land, but it's more like, "Oh, my countryside." And so I was really struck with at that moment, this child dreamed of living in rural areas. This is all she wants and everything she wants. And so if we're thinking about inclusive education for children in rural areas, we must think about the rural context, and we must think about helping those children achieve their dreams in the context in which they love. And so that was my main feeling about her. And so just to finish up now, so there were some limitations, of course there were. My research site was just 1 hour from a semi-urban hub, and children's participation was reduced less than I would have liked it to be, because there was no suitable translator at the beginning, and also had travel restrictions in the last 2 months. There we go. I was going to show you a video. I don't think we'll have time, but I can send you the link for that. I managed to have my research illustrated and animated, and I can send you all the link for that in a separate email. Oh, no, wait. Okay.
In the mountains.
And then I want to say thank you very much for listening, and just I have permission to use this child, this photo of this child, that you just never know what children think. And here's an example of a child doing something when you hadn't expected it, and it makes it all the more important that we listen to children when we do our research. Thank you. Thank you. So Javiera, I'm really conscious that people might have to go, and that's absolutely fine if you've got to go, no problem. Please feel free to go. But Javiera, was there any particular questions that people had asked that I should answer before we finish?
Congratulations on your presentation, Julia. That was fantastic. We have 2 questions. One is for you, and one is, I think that is for everyone, so I'm going to read them both. I will start with the one that is for Julia. So Basirat says, "Thank you, Julia, for a brilliant presentation. Regarding the children with disabilities, are you able to share the categorizations or types of impairment that were covered? Also, to what extent did the disabilities affect your ability to conduct interviews with the children? For example, children who use limited speech for communication." And I'm also going to read the other one. That is, "My question is about the impact of the pandemic to those with disabilities. Here in the UK and also in other places, people with disability were overlooked and suffer more, as some are at greater risk of dying of COVID, for example. Many vulnerable children had to shield, and their parents still fear the risk of catching COVID. What do you think about inclusion of children with disability after COVID? How can we protect disabled people that are at great risk of catching COVID after so many deaths, and the idea that it is normal, using colons, to lose people with comorbidities, for example, which to me, to the person that is asking the question, was a new kind of eugenics. Thanks. So that's our—
Thanks, Javiera. So just thanks, Basira, for your question, and lovely that you're here. And so, yes, in terms of the impairment groups for my research, then the children were identified using the Washington group questions. And through that, the main category of difficulty, functional difficulty children had was remembering and learning, and also behaviour. And so of my 26 children, that was 18 for remembering, 14 for behaviour, and learning was 16. There are also some children with visual difficulties and 5 who had quite significant communication difficulties. And so as you're talking there about the interviews, so what I had to do around that was specifically children with the communication difficulties. I had to use lots of visuals and help them to be able to point to things for their answer, also to do drawings. And sometimes I think when you're working with children, especially with disabilities, it's like I describe it as coming in sideways. So it's kind of coming alongside where a child is working and the kind of things they're interested in talking about. And during those conversations, getting a sense of where they're at and working with the things that they have in front of them as much as the interview techniques themselves. So one girl with a particular communication difficulty and learning difficulties. And so with her, I was able to use, in the end, I used puppets. And so she was playing with dolls. And so I came and played alongside her and we used puppets to talk about her likes and dislikes. Thank you. And then for the second question, did Leda or Marisol want to speak so I can have a quick drink of water?
Can you, could you please, Javiera, repeat the question?
Overall speaking, it
was about the pandemic, wasn't it? Sorry, I remembered it.
And the impact on children with disabilities and their families. And what are your thoughts about the inclusion of those children and their families after the pandemic?
But that does not only apply to Colombia. Please go ahead, Marisol. I think it was a general question about, in general, not just Colombia, right?
Yeah, I can answer in some ways because, bueno, yo puedo contestar.
I can answer some of these questions because I have the opportunity to participate in a group of advisors for UNICEF, a group created to think about this precisely. Because of the pandemic, some needs appeared to support and analyze. So UNICEF created this group of advisors for this. So what we aim to do is try to know what's happening in Latin American region. So I can share with you some of those ideas. First, based on the data, the population that was most affected in terms of education was the children with disabilities. Because as you know, the situation is very associated to poverty. So families didn't have access to technology or to internet because they were in remote areas. Also, the parents didn't have the tech skills to help. And fourth, the teachers didn't have the experience that they felt that each student is different and that every learning process is different. Not only people with disabilities. So teachers who were so overcharged with work, with parents trying to ask how to teach. So the teachers left behind the cases which were more complex, the people with disability. So the population of children with disabilities were the most affected during the pandemic. Another thing that we discovered was the interest of ministries of education to send to some areas some resources to teach, but it was very chaotic. So in the second year, it was more positive because the ministries of education started to say that they should prioritize students with disabilities. I remember a very specific experience in Peru where the ministry said that they were going to negotiate. I don't know if this happened or not. They wanted to negotiate with the parents to open some services for people with disabilities, to open some schools. So they asked at what time of the day they wanted to go and which services they wanted to receive. So in the second year of the pandemic, the ministries learned the lessons from the first year, and also the parents learned some lessons. So what the pandemic shown us is not something that started now, it was happening before. This limitation in technology was something that was present before. So now, like, the promise is that we shouldn't forget the lessons learned thanks to the pandemic. In terms of health in the region, it was a disaster. Despite like the World Health Organization said that youth people and people with disabilities should be prioritized, this was not the case in many countries in Latin America. They were the last to get access to vaccination. It was terrible. So yeah, like it was like very bad for people with disabilities. So the pandemic made like created a loss of some things that had been achieved before. But there is a message that I would like to say for the educational system, and it is that it's possible to think that it's possible to humanize a little bit more in the aspect, social and emotional aspects. It's possible to be more human in that sense. Unfortunately, the pandemic had a very, very bad balance, and the research is showing how this had like a very, very bad effect. Now,
in my other area of work, which is a multisensory impairment, deaf blindness, I have explored a lot whatever is out there about how deaf-blind people experience the pandemic, and they are one of the most marginalized. They have been one of the most marginalized groups, just because for them touch is very important for communication, for accessing the environment. They need physical proximity and touch. So this was one of the issues that emerged with the pandemic, the mask wearing and the social distancing and virtual communication. These were some of the very serious issues that they faced. And access to services, which is what Marisol has been saying. And I also think that I'm not 100% certain how other countries have experienced the impact on schooling, but in my experience as a parent and an education professional, I think the inequalities in this country here, in the English context, in terms of children having access to those remote lessons, whatever those lessons might be, there was no sense that in this country here we have one single approach, yes, or a single learning platform which allows every single child from every walk of life, rich, poor, educated parents, non-educated parents, to have an education. It was just down to the local schools. One school would offer online lessons every day, and the one next to it would not. They would just send homework to the parents. So I think when there's no systematic and equitable approach, there's a lot of scope for inequality, and there are groups that are going to be left behind. And yes, one of the groups most left behind were those with complex needs who attend special schools and who need one-to-one support for, you know, feeding, for hygiene, so these are very challenging issues. But yes, it's very interesting that now we are in a post-pandemic, as someone mentioned to me in my presentation in the National University of Colombia this Saturday, when Marisol very kindly invited me. I was talking about the post-conflict, this era of post-conflict in Colombia, and someone told me we are in a post-pandemic, so now we have this added issue to think about. So it's very interesting, very good question. But yeah, it's about not leaving anyone behind. And thinking again about what Marisol said, there are no groups who deserve to be left behind or who are less worthy, or, oh, it's okay, they're disabled, or they're ill, they're old, they're, you know, all these other groups who, you know, society sometimes thinks that it's okay for them to suffer more, or, you know.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm well aware we're over time, and I know that members of the group have to leave. So I'm aware there's 2 more questions here, and I will be able to email you those answers. Thank you to Carolina and Luz Miriam. Just to say thank you so much to everybody who's taken part today. Thank you to Javiera, who's been here to hold my hand and has made it go through so smoothly. Thank you very much. And thank you overall to Marisol and Leda and Shaun for your wonderful contributions and to being so supportive of my research. You've always helped me go further, so I do appreciate that. And especially to Leda, who was very positive on my Viva. Whew, that was a relief. And also to...
It was a good Viva.
Well, thank you very much. I thought it went much better than I expected, so thank you. And also thank you very much to Javi coming along. He is also doing really interesting research in Latin American cinema. You can read about him if you Google him. And so can I thank you all very much for coming. I just by mistake, I don't know if you can see, but I've got LMO 2003. That's Luz Miriam, who hosted me while I was in Colombia, and I noticed she was there and I've somehow added her to the group. But she let me sleep on her sofa for 9 months while I was in Colombia, and I can't appreciate that enough. And I dedicate my research to her. And thank you very, very much. And I'll see you at graduation on July the 23rd. So thank you so much, everybody. Please feel free to go now, and I appreciate you staying extra. Thank you very much. Goodbye now. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Gracias.
Gracias, Marisol.
Gracias,
Bueno.
Julia.
Gracias.
Nos vemos.
Ahí sí nos vemos. Chao.
Chao.
Gracias por la presentación.
Ay.